Sherry, Patty, thanks so much for joining us. First of all, I have to say I have such admiration for both of your work. This story was incredible. Can you tell us, how did this get started? I'll start with you, Patty.
Well, Sherry has been working on this for 10 years. We met through the Clean Water Broken Promises investigation, which APTN was a key member of. And when she'd reached a certain point in her research, Canada's National Observer brought me in to do the investigative storytelling and data examination and bring this to a more general audience.
Awesome. So Sherry, you've been working on this for 10 years. I know that, APTN had been kind of plugging away on something similar back in like 2004. What got you onto it in the first place? Was it through the Elbow-Head Institute?
Actually, it was through work with the Algonquin-Superior Lake. They'd had third-party management imposed on them, and I had a very front-row view working with them for over a decade in the impacts of the policy, but also how coercive its imposition could be and how hard it was to get out of it.
There's digging out of the hole of third-party management at Gull Bay. Chief King is quoted as saying, a whole bunch of people made money on our backs and on our misery. Sherry, you've seen it, I'm sure, a lot of times in your research, in your career. How common is this for people at home thinking like, oh, this must just be kind of a one-off situation where the government intervenes and and screws things up, makes things worse than what they were previously. Is that the case, or is it more common than we might think?
I think what's really extraordinary about this collaboration is that we were able to show decisively that this is a absolute trend and impact of the policy in terms of having very, very strong correlations with boil water advisories. For example, 65 out of 112 First Nations that we looked at that were under the policy between 2008 and 2016 ended up under boil water advisories or with significant disrepair to their housing. So this isn't something that can be just written off as, happening maybe to a few communities. This is something that is absolutely endemic to the policy itself.
Patty, you've spent years delving into government and its dealings with First Nations. This investigation, obviously, but also Clean Water Broken Promises, that you were talking about before, that shows us Ottawa promises things, gets involved in things, and manages to screw it up. And it doesn't seem to matter which political party is in power. I'll put this to actually both of you. I'll start with you, Patty, and then go to Sherry. What is the common thread that the government manages to keep screwing things up, whatever file it is, whether it's water, whether it's management of bans? Is there a root problem, or is it a bunch of different problems?
Well, this policy dates to at least the 1990s. And what really strikes you, like reading all the documents and talking with people, is that there was no way First Nations could win using this policy. It relied on some of the, fundamental racist tropes that are at the heart of Canada's relationship with First Nations. The policy relies on the idea that First Nations people are not good financial managers. And so First Nations leaders and administrators were penalized for doing exactly the same fiscal prudence, like exactly the same budgetary moves that a non-Indigenous council member or mayor would not only receive praise for, but would be called, fiscally prudent. And so under this policy, if you can't win, then you're at the mercy of the system. And so people couldn't intervene when the federal government decided it was time to move in and put the intervention policy in place. And at that point, the First Nation had no possibility of preventing this. We found more than 24 court cases trying to alter various aspects of this policy, and there was just no getting out of it. So what it shows is that when the federal government moves in and moves elected leaders out of place, or overrides elected leaders, it's not going to work out too well, probably, according to the data.
Yeah. Sherry, what would you add to that? I'm sure like you've seen it all at this point in your research. What would you add to that sentiment?
I think I would add the fact that reserves were built as debt traps in the sense that they've been systemically underfunded since really they were first set up. The funding formulas never matched the actual need in communities. So the fact that there is this high incident of what's called default, but is actually just mostly First Nations moving budget lines around because they need to patch infrastructure so people have clean water, or they need money because there's a forest fire and they need to replace infrastructure. These crises are sort of self-producing because there aren't sufficient funds to be able to cover basic needs. And so I would say one thread of mismanagement that runs through this is the insufficient funding to First Nations through contribution agreements and through grant funding for infrastructure.
Yeah. Okay, well, we got to wrap it up there. I'll leave last thoughts to you. Is there anything you'd like to add to this?
Well, we would love it if First Nations former and current administrators, leaders, community members, if you would like to see your data, how the community, the records that we were able to gather on what happened in your community while it was under default management policy, please contact us. So we've set up an email address, interventionpolicy@protonmail.com. interventionpolicy@protonmail.com. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you, ladies. And again, good work. So much admiration for what you guys did.
Thank you so much for having us.